But even if he was an idiot, the difference in status between them was like the stars in the sky and a loach in the paddy field, so he had to pay attention to his etiquette and be respectful. Because she was not a maidservant. She was the fourth princess of the Tang dynasty, Li Yu. Li Yu quietly looked at the young man's side profile. His youthful face looked very ordinary. Apart from the small dimples that occasionally appeared when he smiled and the freckles that were not ugly under the firelight, there was nothing special about him. However, the performance of such an ordinary young soldier in battle reminded her more than once of the indifferent tiger leaping over the bushes on the grassland. For some reason, she, who had just experienced a thrilling assassination, felt much more relaxed and calm as long as she looked at Ning Ke, who was not far away from her, even though she still had a lingering fear after experiencing a thrilling assassination. Perhaps it was because the young man was guarding her like a ferocious tiger. But the problem was that she did not like this young man. From the city of Wei to the way he disguised himself as a maidservant to the way he behaved, whether he was disguised as a maidservant or now as a princess, she disliked the behavior of this border town soldier. What made her even more unhappy was that she always felt that Ning Ke's respect for her was just for show, and she could not see any sincerity. She even always felt that he should be laughing at her in some dark corner. It had to be said that a woman's intuition was always a terrible weapon, whether it was a peasant woman in the village or a resentful woman in the palace. As the most distinguished princess of the Tang Empire, as long as she thought that a low-level soldier was mocking her, she should be angry. But now, what the princess felt was that sitting next to him, sitting next to the fire, made her feel relaxed and safe. She felt protected. She liked this feeling, but she did not like that this feeling appeared because of Ning Quebec. Therefore, she felt inexplicably ashamed and annoyed. She slightly narrowed her eyes to look at his side profile, and deliberately spoke in a much colder tone. When the enemy attacked just now, it seemed that you wanted to go into the horse carriage to save me? What palace was I? Daming Palace? Wuxia Palace? Anyway, the real me was not in the horse carriage at that time. Now I say that you wanted to save me at that time, I am mocking you for only thinking about making a contribution. Actually, I knew that Her Highness was Her Highness when we were in the city of Wei. Ning Ke looked at her and explained seriously. Her Highness was Her Highness, and the me in the horse carriage was naturally not a princess. Small tricks that might be useful in alluring the enemy were, in fact, only low-level camouflage in the eyes of real smart people. Li Yu slightly frowned. On the other side, the bodyguards had already fallen asleep. The night was deep and the birds were occasionally awakened by the stars and carelessly chirped. Ning Ke looked at the crystal color in her eyes in surprise. He followed her gaze and found that she was looking at a pile of bodyguards and grassland barbarians' bodies by the road. Thinking of her wiping the little boy's nose and seeing her sad feelings for her subordinates, Ning Ke's impression of the princess changed again. He silently thought that even if she was an idiot, she was still an idiot with humanity. Sang Sang fell asleep on his knees. Only he and Li Yu were still awake by the bonfire. The two of them sat quietly. Suddenly, the little brute boy struggled out of her arms. He rubbed his eyes and said that he couldn't sleep and wanted to listen to a story. Li Yu looked embarrassed. She thought that she had long forgotten the stories she had heard in the palace when she was young. How could she tell the novels about scholars and beautiful women that she loved to listen to when she was a young girl to a child? The little barbarian boy did not make a noise. He just looked at his nominal mother pitifully and unwillingly. Ning Ke looked at the embarrassed princess with a smile and gently coughed twice. The wheat was golden, and the oats were green. The duck eggs cracked one by one, but the biggest egg didn't move at all. The mother duck looked at the big and ugly baby and watched it swimming happily in the water. She said proudly, "Look, it's not a hateful turkey, it's my baby. But it is too ugly. No matter where it goes, people will point at it." The wild duck said that as long as you don't marry the ducks of our tribe, it has nothing to do with us. One night, when the beautiful sun was setting in the west of the wilderness, the ugly duckling saw a flock of big birds flying out of the woods. The ugly duckling had never seen such beautiful things. They were white and shiny, with long and soft necks. They spread their beautiful wings and flew to the warm country. After a winter, the ugly duckling was surrounded by several swans. It felt ashamed. It felt so ugly, but the swans gently pecked its feathers. It suddenly saw how beautiful it was in the pool. Spring came. The sun was very warm. The lilacs hung their branches in the water in front of the ugly duckling. People watched the ugly duckling dance and sing happily. They shouted happily, "Look at that beautiful swan." Ning Kai took a piece of charred wood and casually drew lines on the ground beside his feet. He lowered his head and told a very old story with a smile. The story was so simple, but so sad and happy. The little barbarian boy lay on the princess's body and listened with wide eyes. Li Yu also gradually became absorbed in the story. Sang Sang woke up. She had heard the story when she was very young, but she still listened quietly with a childish smile on her face. The night grew darker. It was obvious that they had been attacked, and they might have been ambushed in the southern foothills. Under such circumstances, the heavily armored cavalrymen, who were not suitable for forest combat, still had to cross the northern mountain road overnight. It could be imagined that they were anxious. Dozens of armored black cavalrymen rushed out of the northern mountain road. When they were about 300 feet away from the two bonfires, the young knight in the front, wearing armor and a red cloak, looked at the people around the bonfires and shouted, "Hua Shangyue of Gushan Commandery is here. Where is His Highness?" Hearing Hua Shanyue's name, the guard who was holding the crossbow instantly relaxed his vigilance and replied loudly. Ning Kai looked down at Princess Li Yu, who was leaning against his shoulder. He saw her eyelashes moving slightly, as if she was about to wake up. He could not help but raise his eyebrows with a smile and silently put away the boxwood bough in his left hand. Like lightning hammering, the horse's hooves broke through the northern mountain road at high speed, rolling up or crushing the fallen leaves. The young general, who called himself Hua Shanyue, patted the saddle and flew down from the horse. He quickly ran to the bonfires and knelt down on one knee. He clasped his fists and said in a hoarse voice, "Shanyue's rescue was late. He deserves to die. Please forgive him, Your Highness." At this time, dozens of black armored cavalrymen rushed into the forest. The exhausted elite cavalrymen of the Tang Empire dismounted and knelt behind Hua Shanyue. They said in unison, "Please forgive him, Your Highness." Li Yu opened her eyes. It seemed that she had just woken up, or perhaps, she had been awake for a long time. She looked at Hua Shanyue, the commandant of the Gushan Commandery, who was kneeling in front of her. She looked at the young general who was loyal to her, and the cavalrymen who had obviously experienced bloody battles to get here. Her eyes were full of encouragement. She smiled and said, "Get up quickly. Do you really want me to punish you?" She was very happy. These cavalrymen of the Tang Empire, who had been ambushed at the southern foot of the northern mountain road and worried about her life, finally saw the virtuous princess again after a year. How could they not be excited? Hua Shanyue raised his head excitedly and was about to say something. But he saw the princess sitting on the shoulder of a young soldier with a particularly natural expression. Seeing this scene, his heart tightened for some reason. There was a trace of surprise and displeasure in his eyes, and he frowned slightly. Ning Kai, who had been watching the black armored cavalryman, saw the young general's face clearly the moment he raised his head. It was a handsome face with sword-like eyebrows, which added a bit of heroic spirit. Chapter 21. Hearing this conclusion, Ning Kai was silent for a long time. Then he raised his head and looked at the old man. He raised his right index finger and pointed it at his temple, as if he was about to commit suicide with a crossbow. He asked seriously, "Doesn't psyche power or consciousness come from the brain?" The old man, Liu Qingchen, looked at him gently and said slowly, "This is not wrong. But although psyche power originates from the head, how can it communicate with the breath of heaven and earth outside the body? The so-called cultivation is to put your psyche into the snow mountain in front of your chest and the ocean of qi behind your waist. There are 17 qi acupoints around the snow mountain and the ocean of qi, just like the thousands of caves at the bottom of Zhongli Mountain. The caves are facing the wind and water, making a wonderful song. Only in this way can the heaven and earth understand our thoughts and respond to each other. The opening or closing of the viscera and qi acupoints are formed in the womb. No matter how hard you cultivate, you can't change it. So there is a saying that cultivation is just a gift from Haotian. I saw that 11 of the 17 acupoints around the snow mountain and the ocean of qi are blocked. So no matter how you cultivate your psyche power, you can't contact the heaven and earth. But you don't have to be sad and disappointed. Among the millions of people in the world, it is rare to see someone with 13 qi acupoints opened. It's normal to have a body like yours, the old man comforted him slowly. Ning Ke lowered his head and smiled bitterly. In the city of Wei, he had comforted himself many times, saying that only the really abnormal geniuses could cultivate. Now it seemed that it was true. According to this standard, those geniuses who had 15 or 16 qi acupoints opened were really favored by the heaven. It was like walking on the road and suddenly being hit by a pie from the heaven. Why didn't I win the super gift? He sighed in his heart and expressed his sincere gratitude to the old man. Then he got off the carriage with Sang Sang. The light of the oil lamp in the carriage was dim. After a long time, the curtain was lifted again. Li Yu, the fourth princess of Tang, sat in front of the old man and slightly leaned forward. She asked, "Is there no possibility at all?" Liu Qingchen admired Ning Ke very much. However, as a psyche master who had already entered the see-through state, he did not hesitate to use his psyche power to check and sort out Ning Ke's body. For example, Her Highness had ordered him to do so. People with strong willpower and pure temperament can often obtain extremely strong psyche power through meditation. Ning Ke is undoubtedly such a person. That's why I had some expectations for him. I thought that perhaps he had only opened 10 of his 17 apertures and was on the verge of enlightenment. However, because he couldn't cultivate in Border City, he couldn't trigger his thoughts to enter the initial state. It's a pity that there are 11 qi openings in his body that are blocked. Haotian doesn't care about him, so it's useless no matter how good his potential is. The old man's face was full of regret. In his opinion, if Ning Ke could really cultivate, even if he only had 10 acupores cleared, his future would be limitless, given his temperament and good handwriting. It was a pity that the fate of this lad was not so good. Since that's the case, there's no need to waste any more energy. Li Yu looked a little tired after days of running around. She lowered her head and pondered for a moment. Then she said calmly, "I really shouldn't trouble you for this matter." Liu Qingchen raised his white eyebrows slowly and looked at the princess's face quietly. He knew that his previous words had determined Ning Ke's future. After confirming that Ning Ke could not cultivate, she directly gave up the idea of cultivating him. After a moment of silence, the old man persuaded, "There are many masters in Chang'an. A young man like Ning Ke may not seem special, but I believe that if this lad grows up for a few more years, he will definitely become the best soldier in the Tang Empire." Li Yu didn't expect the old man to have such a high evaluation of Ning Quebec. She frowned slightly and explained slowly, "That lad's martial arts skills and temperament are excellent. If he was still in the city of Wei or in the army, I would definitely make him work for me at all costs. But now he is going to enter the academy and walk on the road of literature. When he is able to influence the imperial court, he will be old and so will I. What's the point then?" The old man was silent for a long time and suddenly said, "Although only 6 of the 17 acupores in his body have been cleared and it's impossible for him to enter the cultivation state according to common sense, but Haotian rotates and nothing is set in stone. After all, my state is too low, but he has a chance to enter the academy. The academy is a wonderful and holy place, another world. In the future, if he can really enter the second floor of the academy, who knows what wonderful things will happen to him. Maybe he can really embark on the path of cultivation. The second floor. Liu shook her head and said, how many people in this world can enter the second floor of the academy? Although Ning Ke is a good lad, you have too much confidence in him. Liu Qingchen looked at her and said with a smile, when you said that he was going to enter the academy and walk on the road of literature, you didn't seem to think that this lad could not enter the academy. You should know that the difficulty of the academy entrance examination is also very high. From this, I can see that you have full confidence in him. Chapter 22. Liu Qingchen smiled and asked, what do you want to know? Ning Ke thought about it for a long time and said, I want to know, what is cultivation? Liu Qingchen smiled and said, you are really greedy. Ning Ke said without any embarrassment, then, can you tell me how many states there are in cultivation and what are the different abilities in different states? It's still a choice beyond my expectation. Liu Qingchen smiled and said, you know, although ordinary people don't know about these things, it is not a secret after all. Not a secret is still a secret. Ning Ke answered with a smile, I will keep it for you. All right. Liu Qingchen laughed and asked after a short pause, do you know Haotian Taoism? Ning Ke looked at this South School wayfarer of Haotian Taoism and nodded. I was born in the South School of Haotian Taoism and was ordered to travel around the world. People often call us wayfarer of school. So since you want to know something about cultivation, I will start from Haotian Taoism. Haotian Taoism worships Haotian and is the only orthodox cultivation in the world. Because Haotian shines on the world, everything in the world can breathe with it. This breath is the breath of nature or primordial qi I talked about last night. So Haotian is the beginning of everything. Humans are originally one of the myriad of beings. Living in ignorance in this journey of heaven and earth, Haotian gave us a revelation, and we began to understand the principles of nature and creation. Therefore, we use our minds to control the qi of heaven and earth and do all kinds of mysterious things. This is cultivation. The road of cultivation is long and arduous. It is a test of willpower. This road is divided into 5 stages, which are the 5 states you mentioned. The initial state is called the initial awareness state. It means that the cultivator's psyche is released from the ocean of qi and mountain of snow and understands the existence of the breath of nature. The second state is called the perception state. In this state, the cultivator can touch the primordial qi floating in the world and live in harmony with it. He can even communicate with it. The third state is called the no-doubt state. It means that the cultivator can understand the rules of the primordial qi flowing in the world and make use of it. The so-called sword master and talisman master refer to this state. The fourth state is called the see-through state. Cultivators who enter this realm are able to merge their consciousness with the primal energies of the universe. For a psychic, this means that they can use their consciousness to attack their enemies. If they stay in this realm for a long time, they may be able to make some special moves. Young man, you don't have to look at me like this. I did enter the see-through realm. Unfortunately, I barely managed to step my right foot into the see-through realm when I was old. Chapter 23. It was late at night. Ning Ke got off the horse carriage. Liu Qingchen lifted the curtain and looked at the back of the lad. Listening to the faint music coming from the frontier fortress in the field, he smiled. As a cultivator who had stepped into the see-through state, even if he only had 1 foot over the high threshold, it was enough for him to be highly respected in any country and any city, and he did not need to deal with ordinary people at all. A psyche master needed more time to meditate and cultivate psyche, so Liu Qingchen's time was really like gold. But he was still willing to spend 1 or 2 nights or even more time chatting with Ning Ke, talking about seemingly trivial things, because he really liked Ning Quebec. He liked the calmness and self-improvement hidden under the young boy's gentle and tender appearance, as well as the heroic spirit that occasionally burst out like the previous moment. Heroic, magnificent, self-improvement and calmness were the most appreciated qualities of the Tang people, and the elder Liu Qingchen was a native of Tang. What he told Ning Ke tonight were all the introductory lessons of the South School of Haotian Taoism. Although it was not a secret and according to the sect rules, ordinary people should not know, he still said it, because he believed in one thing: I always feel that you will become a great cultivator in the future. He knew that Ning Ke's chi aperture was blocked and it was impossible for him to cultivate. However, the old man had no reason to believe that Ning Ke could embark on the difficult path he was currently walking on. He also hoped that Ning Ke could walk more steadily and further than him. The old man looked at the fading and blurred back of the lad outside the window, and murmured to himself, I only start to be presumptuous and blindly follow my intuition when I am about to die. Maybe, this is the enlightenment of Haotian to me. When they returned to the shabby tent, Sang Sang had already returned. Ning Ke asked what the princess wanted her to do, and as expected, he got a vague answer. He had long been accustomed to his little handmaiden's laziness in using her brain, so he jokingly scolded her and drank a few cups of wine. Then the two of them washed up hastily and went to bed. The next day, under the protection of hundreds of cavalrymen, the caravan continued southward towards Chang'an. Ning Ke and his servants' days were no longer as boring as before. Before nightfall, Liu Qingchen would ask Ning Ke to sit in his carriage and chat with him. Her Royal Highness also often asked Sang Sang to accompany her. Fortunately, Peng Guotao had sent a bodyguard to drive the simple carriage, otherwise Ning Ke would have been forced to play without a driver. As they chatted in the carriage, Ning Ke learned more about cultivation, such as the various ways that cultivators use their psyche to control the chi of heaven and earth, and how cultivators could strengthen their connection with heaven and earth through some special items. He also learned how sword masters use their psyche to compress the primordial chi into invisible ropes and then tie up the thin and sharp hiltless flying sword. There were no strict standards for special items to strengthen the connection between cultivators and heaven and earth. Haotian Taoism often used wooden horsetail whisk sword, Buddhism often used prayer beads and wooden fish, and as for fu paper flying swords, they were very common standard equipment. It was relatively rare that some grand cultivators would use strange items such as brush, ink, and magic staffs. Using psyche power to seal the chi of heaven and earth into the fu paper is a talisman master, sealing the chi of heaven and earth into the tactical array is a tactical array master, condensing the chi of heaven and earth into the sword is a sword master, using psyche power to directly mobilize the chi of heaven and earth is a psyche master, and so on. Liu Qingchen held a cup of green tea and leaned against the window as he spoke leisurely. Hey, are you kidding me? What kind of master is he if he seals the chi of heaven and earth in the toilet bowl? Horse master or barrel master? After chatting for a long time, the old and the young naturally became familiar with each other. Ning Ke gradually showed his indolent and rude side. He bit a brush dipped in ink and waved his right arm to express his strong doubts. The old man put down the teacup, stared at the lad and scolded, Do you know what a convention is? It has been called for thousands of years, what's the problem? Common achievements should be easy to remember, don't make those sour words. All right. Ning Ke failed miserably in the face of the thickness of time represented by thousands of years. He hung his wrist in the shaking carriage and calmed himself down. The thick black tip of the brush moved quickly and slowly on the snow-like rice paper, making notes. As for the fighting methods of cultivators, sword masters use swordsmanship, talisman masters use talisman techniques, and psyche masters like me, of course, use psyche skills. Grand cultivators who have entered the knowing destiny state can hardly be specifically distinguished. I once heard that some elders in the previous generation practiced divine skills, but I don't know the details. These names are not impressive enough. Ning Kei's expression was a little stiff. He bit the tail of the brush and looked at the old man, saying vaguely, I feel that they can be called magicians, and what they use is called magic. The old man's white eyebrows were tightly knitted, and he looked at him sternly and said, the problem is, how do you explain the word magic? Chapter 24. It is said that there are as many warriors as dogs in Chang'an and sword masters are everywhere. But this is an exaggeration. But it is the capital of the empire, the most magnificent place in the world. There are many hidden talents and cultivators. If you go to Chang'an, you will be fine in the academy. But you should be careful when you are outside the academy. Yes. Ning Kei answered and then asked tentatively, Mr. Liu, is there anyone in Chang'an that I need to be wary of, or should I say, someone powerful that I can't afford to offend? Liu Qingchen looked at the lad and sneered, who said that he didn't want to know this that night. Ning Kei smiled and scratched his head. It's meaningless to talk about this. Liu Qingchen shook his head with a smile and said, you just need to remember that there are many schools of cultivation in the world. Buddhism, Taoism, Diabolism and the Academy are the three sections. Buddhism lives in remote places and Taoism sets up altars everywhere. Don't mention the devil's doctrine. Taoism is the Haotian Taoism school I belong to. There are many powerful cultivators and they are respected and worshipped by the royal families of various countries. If you have heard of the West Hill Divine Kingdom, you should know that it is the headquarters of Haotian Taoism. Respected and worshipped by the royal families of various countries. Does the empire treat Haotian Taoism the same way? Ning Kei frowned and asked. Liu Qingchen smiled bitterly. As the most powerful country in the world, the Tang Empire was the only secular royal family that dared to disrespect Haotian Taoism. Haotian Taoism could do nothing to the empire. But he was a Tang citizen, but in Haotian Taoism, he was in an awkward situation. What about the devil's doctrine? Are there any powerful cultivators in the devil's doctrine? Ning Kei noticed the strange look on the old man's face, so he quickly changed the topic and said with a smile, speaking of which, you said that the great sword master used the methods of the devil's doctrine at the entrance of the northern mountain road. I really don't understand what is the method of the devil's doctrine. Hearing the words, devil's doctrine, Liu Qingchen became serious and said, don't remember this part and don't tell anyone else. Yes, sir. Whether it is Taoism, Buddhism or the Academy, these decent cultivators all use people to perceive the qi of heaven and earth and live in harmony with each other. More precisely, they can use the qi of heaven and earth. Liu Qingchen squinted his eyes, as if he was recalling something. He said slowly, the devil's doctrine is different from the other sections. They absorb the qi of heaven and earth into their bodies by force. Is there something wrong? No matter how Ning Kei thought about it, he did not find anything wrong with this cultivation method. It seemed to be more direct to understand it literally. Chapter 25. Ning Kei recalled the feeling in the dream seriously and said, in my dream, those continuous but rhythmic breaths finally became something substantial. They gathered together and enveloped my body. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't hold those things that were lighter than water. I could only watch them slip through my fingers. Liu Qingchen suppressed his excitement and asked in a low voice, how big was the range you felt in the dream? No, I should say, what was it like? A basin of water? A stream? Or a small pond? Ning Kei raised his head and answered blankly, it was like a sea. Liu Qingchen's body stiffened slightly and then he fell back to the soft cushion. After a long silence, he laughed at himself with a tired smile and murmured, yes, how could it be? Ning Kei had guessed from his expression that things were not as he had imagined, but he still asked, Mr. Liu, is this the initial state you mentioned? Is what I felt the breath of heaven and earth? Liu Qingchen patted his shoulder to comfort him and said bitterly, the initial state is the initial awareness state. I told you a few days ago that the cultivator's psyche is released from the ocean of chi and mountain of snow and begins to understand the existence of the breath of heaven and earth. In other words, this is the first moment when a secular person opens his eyes and sees a whole new world. The first world he sees determines the future of this cultivator. Because what he sees and what he feels is the projection of the primal energies of all things in the world on his mind. And the purer, the stronger, and more compact this cultivator's meditation will be, the greater the range of the primal energies he can feel. The old man looked at Ning Ke quietly and said, "Cultivators with poor aptitudes can only feel the chi of heaven and earth in the initial awareness state, and the projection in their soul is just a basin of water. Cultivators with better aptitudes can feel the chi of heaven and earth in a wider range, and the projection is just a small pond. If he can feel a stream or even a lake, then he will become a respected grand cultivator in the future." Ning Ke frowned and wanted to say something, but was stopped by the old man. The old man continued, "There are very few people who have reached the peak of the knowing destiny state. Among them, Lu Bai, the sage of sword from the South Jin kingdom, is the most talented. He entered the initial state when he was less than 6 years old. As soon as he entered the initial state, he saw an endless yellow river. This was a true genius. This is why he was able to dominate the South with his yellow river sword will, and is now regarded by all the cultivators in the world as the person most likely to break through the 5 states. If seeing a yellow river was the most powerful cultivator in the world, then what about seeing an ocean?" Ning Ke was silent for a long time. Although he had many secrets, he had never thought of himself as a genius, not to mention a genius who was more abnormal than the universally recognized geniuses. However, he was still a little unwilling. Maybe this sounds a little arrogant, a little unreasonable, or narcissistic. He chose his words carefully, lowered his head and said slowly, "Is it possible that I'm really stronger than the sword sage of South Jin Kingdom? It's just because I've been meditating for so many years that I can feel a wider range when I entered the initial awareness state. What's wider than a raging river? I don't know, but I'm sure it's not the boundless ocean, because they are two completely different concepts." Liu Qingchen looked at Ning Ke, who was lowering his head, and sighed softly. He said, "Kid, do you know what the ocean represents when you enter the initial awareness state? It represents the chi of heaven and earth of the whole world. No one can see everything in that new world the moment they open their eyes. That's because it's impossible. Even the legendary saints can't do it." He patted the young lad's slightly stiff shoulder again, and comforted him with a smile, "Although it's just a dream, it's not a bad dream." Ning Ke left in silence. He had always been indifferent to cultivation. If it weren't for Liu Qingchen's advice these days, which made him have some unnecessary thoughts, his mood would probably be much better now. As the saying goes, if there was no hope, there would naturally be no disappointment. If there was despair at the beginning, then there would be no hope at the beginning at all. The little handmaiden Sang Sang brought the basin of hot water in front of him, deftly wrung the towel, and then covered his tired face with the slightly hot and steaming towel. She asked curiously, "Young master, what did you ask tonight?" Ning Ke's voice came out from under the hot towel, as if it had been moistened by the steaming water. It hummed in a low voice, "I went to tell old Liu that I have a little secret that I won't tell you. But since I told you, should you tell me that you have already seen through my little secret, and then bow down to me, a talented cultivation genius?" Sang Sang kept repeating these words in her mind, and then she felt a little dizzy, and hurriedly rubbed her eyebrows. She pulled off the towel from Ning Ke's face and rubbed it twice in the water. Then she twisted her waist and splashed the water out of the carriage. She said, "Young master, it seems that you have become more of an idiot this time." Indeed, he looked like an idiot. Ning Ke turned around and looked at the stars above the field through the window. His palm subconsciously touched his cheeks to touch those tiny freckles that could not be touched at all. He murmured in a low voice, "So what if I can play with the flying sword? I can play with the Shenyuan sword, but can you guys?" Sang Sang could not help but shake her head when she heard that he was talking nonsense that she did not understand. Ning Ke sat up and took out the worn-out article on the response of the Tao. He did not open it, but silently stared at the cover for a long time, as if he was trying to find out what secrets were hidden in it. "Bring the basin over." His voice was much calmer now. He lit the match and moved it to a corner of the book. After a while, the old yellow book began to burn. He gently loosened his fingers, letting the article on the response of the Tao, which had accompanied him for many years, fall into the brass basin and burn faster and faster. Sang Sang looked at this scene in surprise. Ning Ke watched as the pages of the book curled and turned black in the flames, and then suddenly burst into flames and finally turned into layers of ashes. He tightened his right hand on the window and felt a little empty in his heart. It was as if a friend who had accompanied him for many years had gone far away and would never come back. It was also as if the dream of his youth had disappeared like a bubble. "Am I very useless?" he asked. Sang Sang shook her head. Ning Ke smiled and said, "No one is better at archery than me, and no one is fiercer than me with a knife. People of my age have not killed as many people as I have. I'm not useless. I'm a woodcutter of Shubi Lake. It's just that I can't do acrobatics with flying swords. If there's a chance in the future, I'll kill some King Grand cultivators like how I killed the horse gang." Sang Sang tightened her lips and nodded with a smile. This was not self-comfort after giving up, but Ning Ke's firm recognition. Those brave bodyguards at the entrance of Northern Mountain Road had almost defeated a great sword master, so why couldn't he? There was no truly invincible person in this world. Those unworldly sublime beings were still human beings, so he could defeat them. In this world, there were many people who found that they were actually very weak and could not fulfill their dreams. They would feel lost, miserable, inferior, or even autistic. Then many people would immerse themselves in this kind of pain or the illusion of success. They would lock themselves in the cage of their hearts and keep struggling, hoping to return to the past. When they found that they could not write the new dream in the brothel, one of the 4 great masterpieces that could be hidden in the deep mountains and passed down for thousands of years, they locked themselves in the village for 30 years, drinking porridge every day and using their left hand as a red sleeve. Did they think that they were Chao Shuoqin? Ning Ke had never been such a person. If he could not be Chao Shuoqin, he would be Jin Yong. If he could not be an emperor, he would be a calligrapher. If he could not be a general, he would be a grand secretary. If he could not be a cultivator, so what? Chapter 26. Ning Ke was in a bad mood after being tossed between hope and disappointment for the past few days. But he quickly stopped thinking about it. No matter if he was happy or unhappy, it was a good time to drink and get drunk. Song Song's illness happened again that night, and her little feet were as cold as ice branches. So the master and handmaiden opened a jar of strong liquor and drank to their heart's content. The little handmaiden drank most of the jar of strong liquor, but Ning Ke was the first one to fall. Sang Sang moved him to the cushion with difficulty, and then lifted the quilt to cover him. She also got in and habitually put her little feet into his arms. Ning Ke had a dream accompanied by the pervading fragrance of the liquor. In the dream, he felt the warm sea beside him again, but this time he didn't reach out to catch it like before, only to find that he could only catch nothing. It should be Liu Qingqin's words that worked. This time he was very clear that he was dreaming, so he stood in the warm sea, like a stranger or a bystander calmly watching everything in front of him. He smiled in the dream and thought of a sentence, "Everything is an illusion, it can't scare me." Maybe because of the unprecedented calmness, Ning Ke could clearly see the appearance of the sea in the dream this time. The boundless sea that occupied the whole space was not blue, but green. The color was very deep and very transparent, like a crystal-clear jade. He stood on the green sea, and didn't bend down to catch the slowly flowing green. Instead, he looked at it quietly, guessing where it would flow next and what kind of shape it would change into. 2 white flowers suddenly appeared in the green sea. The petals were snow white, without a trace of other colors, and without the common color of those common flowers, it was just a monotonous and boring white. The seawater slapped against the roots of the white flowers. If they had roots, under the nourishment of the green seawater, the 2 white flowers grew rapidly at a speed visible to the naked eye. The petals fell off one by one, and fell on the sea and became new white flowers. In this way, the white flowers quickly spread and occupied the whole sea in his sight, extending to the sky. Ning Ke looked at such a beautiful scene, and his mind was shaken. He stepped on the flowers and walked to the sky, stepping on the petals. His bare feet touched the delicate petals of the white flowers, bouncing up and down, feeling the softness and tenderness, very wonderful. In the carriage beside the field, Ning Ke was lying on his side on the cushion. Most of the mattress on his body had already been lifted. His forehead was full of sweat and he was holding a pair of small feet tightly in his arms. The skin on the little handmaiden's feet was much better than the rest of her body. It was as white as snow and looked like 2 small white flowers. He furrowed his brows and curled his lips from time to time. No one knew what he was thinking in his dream. His feet subconsciously kicked the mattress, and he didn't know where he touched, but he felt very comfortable. A satisfied expression appeared on his face, and he stopped moving. His mind gradually blurred and Ning Ke had long forgotten that he was in a dream. His mind was shaky but unusually calm as he walked on the surface of the sea and among the white flowers. Suddenly, his heart skipped a beat and his whole body slowly floated away from the petals and quickly flew to the sky above the sea. When he reached a very high altitude, he looked down and saw that the white flowers on the green sea had long disappeared. He could faintly see a layer of red surface in the depths of the sea, extending in all directions. He broke through the seawater and dived into the depths of the green sea. After diving for a long time, he finally saw the layer of red. It was a layer of viscous deep red slurry. It was boundlessly red and looked like tomato sauce, but more like blood that was about to solidify. The blood suddenly broke the silence and became boiling. Inside, there were countless people without facial features slowly stood up and then fell down. They stood up again and fell down again. They struggled and silently cried in pain. But no matter how they struggled and cried, the thin film on their facial features always imprisoned them in the eternal silent world of blood. The deepest fear in his life slowly and unstoppably occupied Ning Ke's body, turning him into a stone statue. Just like that, he stood beside the red blood sea in ignorance, watching the silent cruel scenes with his own eyes. The blood sea turned into land, and then there was also a sky. Ning Ke stood between the sky and the ground and found himself in the wilderness. There were countless corpses under his feet and in the distance. Those corpses were the cavalry of the Tang Empire, the warriors of the Yueluan Kingdom, the crossbowmen of the South Jin Kingdom, and many elite cavalries of the grassland barbarians. Countless amounts of blood flowed from the bodies of these soldiers and dyed the entire wilderness red. 3 black smoke stably floated in front of the wilderness, looking in this direction indifferently as if they were alive. It's getting dark. I've said that it's getting dark, but no one has ever believed me. Someone said in a disdainful tone beside Ning Ke's ear. Ning Ke suddenly turned around. He did not see who had spoken, but he saw many people looking up at the sky. Among them were the confused peddlers, the unwilling officials, the timid young ladies, and the crazy laughing monks. No matter how different their clothes and expressions were, they all had one thing in common, which was that they all raised their heads high like fat geese waiting to be fed. Countless people in the wilderness looked up at the sky in horror. Without the shadow of the woodcutters of Shubi Lake around them, the prosperous days of Chang and in their imagination suddenly became lively and cheerful. The cavalrymen from the Gushan commandery, who were responsible for bringing up the rear, looked around vigilantly and held the reins with one hand. Their commander, Huashangyue, glanced at Ning Ke and then sped up. It was as if Ning Ke did not exist in his eyes at all. Perhaps he had really forgotten the existence of this insignificant person. Ning Ke should not care about the other's attitude. After entering Chang'an, the other was the son of a noble family and the most outstanding figure in the younger generation of the Tang military. Now that he had been released from the military, he was just a commoner at the bottom. If he was lucky enough to enter the academy, he would just be an inconspicuous brick in the imperial bureaucracy. No matter how he looked at it, he would no longer have anything to do with Huashangyue, who had once shown hostility and even killing intent. But would he be willing to let his life pass like this? He would not, so he was very clear that he and this proud young general would meet again one day, and that day should not be too far away. After the princess carriage and the escorting cavalries left, the number of people in the town suddenly decreased by more than half. However, it became much livelier than before. The peddlers who did not dare to set up their stalls just now came out of nowhere. The stalls that were closed to avoid trouble also reopened their doors and began to seize the time to do business. After selling the broken carriage at a broken price to a shop in the town that even accepted broken goods, Ning Ke patted Song Song's thin shoulder to comfort her. The old carriage and horse had been with them for many years in the city of Wei, and they would be reluctant to sell it like this. However, Chang'an was right in front of them, and it was not appropriate to reminisce and be sentimental. They did not choose the spacious official road that could accommodate 8 carriages side by side. Instead, they strolled along the ridges beside the official road. The cauliflower in the field was in full bloom, the butterflies were slowly flapping their wings in the spring breeze, and the annoying bees were buzzing everywhere. The little handmaiden's tears gradually dried up. She held the lace of the parcel tightly with both hands and dragged the parcel that seemed to be bigger than her. She walked along the ridges and looked at it occasionally with a smile. Under the sun, Ning Ke took over the heavy parcel and chatted with the little handmaiden. Although he often did not get a response, he still enjoyed it. His eyes greedily swept over the farmland and the countryside. When he saw the farmers who were resting in the fields not far away, he waved his hand to greet them, and when he saw the butterflies flying in front of him, he was ready to pounce on them. He left Chang'an when he was very young. Since then, he had been living in the vast Min Mountain, the grassland, the wilderness, and small border towns. There were only dangerous forests, boring grasslands, and omnipresent dangers around him. Now that he had returned to the center of the empire, he could not hide his joy and excitement when he saw these peaceful and beautiful sceneries and life. About 2 or 3 hours later, a shadow suddenly spread from the stream and peach forest in front of them to the top of their heads. Ning Ke thought that it was not night yet, and there was no sign of rain in the sky. He looked up in confusion and saw a black city wall suddenly appearing in front of him. This city wall was so high that it seemed to have no end. It covered half of the sky and blocked the sun that had not yet set. Looking at it, he could vaguely see 3 black spots hovering in the sky above the city wall. Looking to the left, he could not see the end of the city wall. Looking to the right, he could not see the end of the city wall either. This huge city was so huge that it could not be seen how wide it was. It stood silently between heaven and earth. Sang Sang stared at the magnificent city in front of her and looked at the crowd on the road not far away. She asked, "Is this Chang'an?" The 3 black spots in the sky flew a little lower. It turned out that 2 eagles were practicing flying with their children. At this time, they were about to return to their nest, which was between the mottled city wall. The city wall had been washed by rain and weathered for thousands of years. The surface looked a little shabby, but the inside of the city wall was still indestructible. The young eagle learned to fly and returned to its nest. Ning Ke looked up at the world's most magnificent city with a sincere smile on his face. He had traveled outside for many years and finally came back today. Chang'an City, long time no see. Chapter 28. Chang'an, the most magnificent city in the world, naturally lived up to its reputation. Because the city was so huge, the empire had opened 18 city gates in the east, west, south, and north directions. But even so, the officials, nobles, and common people who entered and left the city still blocked these city gates from time to time, forming a long queue on the official road. Ning Ke and Sang Sang waited in the long queue until dusk. Ning Ke, who was sweating profusely, could not help but think of the big traffic jam in the capital of another world when he saw the solemn sergeants carefully checking their luggage. He shook his head and scolded them with a smile. He cursed in a low voice, but the residents of Chang'an around him cursed in a particularly loud voice. The people of the Tang Empire were simple and fierce. Few people were afraid of those seemingly solemn soldiers. However, no one dared to ignore the strict laws of the empire and barge in like this. Finally, it was Ning Ke and Sang Sang's turn. The soldier took the document from the military ministry that Ning Ke handed over and found that the lad was actually a comrade of his and had made many military achievements in the front line. The serious expression on his face suddenly became much gentler. However, when his gaze fell on the 3 hilts on Ning Ke's back, he could not help but frown. This is a family heirloom sword. My ancestor once told me. Ning Ke carefully explained. As long as the sword lives, the man lives. As long as the sword dies, the man dies. The sergeant glanced at him with boredom, waved his hand and said contemptuously, I have to hear this 800 times a day. Little guy, save it. Take off your luggage. You two are so small. You don't look like you are here for an exam. It looks like you are moving house. He turned to look at the big black umbrella on Sang Sang's back, frowned and asked, what kind of umbrella is this? Why is it so big? Sang Sang held the middle part of the big black umbrella behind her back and looked up at the sergeant coldly. She said, as long as the umbrella lives, the man lives. As long as the umbrella dies, the man dies. The sergeant looked at the little black girl and gave her a thumbs up. He praised, that's creative. Ning Ke was untying his bag with a bitter smile on his young face. He thought to himself that he was probably the only one in the world who knew that Sang Sang's words were not a joke. There were bedding, blankets, and other miscellaneous items in the large bundle. The only thing worth paying special attention to was the boxwood bow and the quiver of arrows. When the soldier flipped through these items, his expression changed slightly. The city gate of Chang'an was long and dark. The exit on the other side of the city was very far away and looked like a small hole that could light up. One could vaguely see the setting sun in the distance. The red light slanted in but was swallowed up by the darkness and noise before it could spread far. Ning Ke and Sang Sang followed the crowd to that place. Sang Sang weighed the heavy bag on her back to make it more comfortable on her shoulders. She asked curiously, young master. Are all the people in Chang'an as talkative as that soldier? Almost. Ning Ke answered, all the wealth and power in the world are concentrated in this city. It's inevitable that the people in Chang'an are a little arrogant. But the more arrogant they are, the more polite and tolerant they appear to be to outsiders. That's because they want to show their elegance. And they are indeed a group of very elegant fellows. But if they don't show their arrogance, anyone would feel anxious. What about the people in Chang'an? They talk. From horse carriages to government offices, all the people in Chang'an are very good at chatting. From the secrets of the royal family to the anecdotes of brothels, it seems that there is nothing in the world that they don't know. Of course, what they like most is to talk about the wars and affairs of the countries or the counties of the Tang Empire in a light tone, as if each of them is a prime minister. Sang Sang giggled, which showed that she was really amused by Ning Ke's words. Previously, when they were checked at the city gate, there was no tragic scene of people being killed or their swords destroyed. Now the big black umbrella was on Ning Ke's back, and the 3 swords on Ning Ke's back were put into his bag. The boxwood bough was also unstrung. After that, the talkative soldier let them go without making things difficult for them. The Tang people worshipped martial arts. If they didn't have a few weapons at hand, it would be more painful than killing them. Therefore, the empire had always been very lax in this aspect. In Chang'an, people were allowed to carry swords, but not knives. They were allowed to carry bows and arrows, but they had to be unstrung. Crossbows were forbidden. Other than that, there were no other restrictions. As for whether one would secretly knock the bowstring and take out the saber after entering the city, no one would care. The Chang and local government would not care. The military ministry would not care. Even the emperor in the palace would not care about these things. Ning Ke and Sang Sang were used to living in the frontier fortress. Every night in the city of Wei, there were no lights except for the taverns. Apart from the soldiers gambling, there were no other sounds. Therefore, when they entered Chang'an at dusk, they thought that they would see a quiet city about to sleep. Unexpectedly, at night, Chang'an was still. Everywhere was lively. The street was full of lights, which illuminated the flat blue stone road as if it were daytime. The pedestrians on the street were weaving, either stopping in front of the stalls or pointing at the stars to look at the sky. Why did her faint body smell like an orchid? Why did she wink at those charming young women who were picking flowers for men at the stalls? Did she think that the young man was a little cute? Ning Ke held Sang Sang's hand and looked around happily. He did not remember that Chang'an was such a unique place when he was young. He felt that he could not walk anymore. Since they could not walk anymore, they walked slowly. The street finally became a little quieter. However, before the two visitors from the border town could calm down and relax, they heard a shout in front of them. Countless people of Chang'an poured out from all directions and blocked a street corner in front of them. Duel. Through the dense crowd, they could vaguely see two men with swords on their waists staring at each other with hatred. Both of their right sleeves were cut off by swords and thrown on the ground between them. The world became quiet. All the onlookers tightly shut their mouths. Ensuring the fairness of the duel was deeply rooted in the blood of every Tangs. Even onlookers had their own rules. The rule of the duel is that cutting one's sleeve represents a challenge. If you accept, you have to cut off a piece of your sleeve. Ning Ke took Sang Sang's hand and squeezed out of the crowd. He explained to her, this kind of duel is called a live game. It's fine as long as there is a winner. There is another kind of duel called a dead game. It needs to be confirmed by the government. The challenger of the dead game has to cut his left palm. If the opponent accepts, he has to do the same. Can I not accept? Sang Sang asked. Of course. Ning Ke wiped the sweat off his forehead and patted the big bag on Sang Sang's back to make sure there was no thief. Then he continued, but sometimes people, especially men, can easily become idiots. For example, when they go crazy for women, love, dignity, and other messy things. The two of them squeezed out of the crowd. Sang Sang looked up and asked confusedly, why don't we stay and watch? I remember that you liked to watch when we were in the city of Wei. You squatted by the side and watched the whole night when the pig was being killed. I've seen a lot of cows and sheep. That year, the pig was killed for the first time in the history of the city of Wei. Of course I have to watch it carefully. Things like duels happen every day in Chang'an. If you want to watch it, there will be plenty of opportunities in the future. Ning Ke said calmly, moreover, this is Chang'an. I just want to study in the academy. I don't want to cause any trouble. From now on, we have to be like two dogs and behave with our tails between our legs. Sang Sang shook her head and thought to herself, I don't want to be a bitch. As for you, young master, just kill less people in Chang'an. It's not suitable for you to behave with your tails between your legs. Let's find an inn. Ning Kai seemed to read her mind and said with a sense of failure, "I'm sleepy." Sang Sang pointed to a building on the street ahead and said, "Look, there's an inn." Chapter 29. Of course, the name of the inn was not really Room Inn. They spent a night there. Ning Kai and Sang Sang rubbed their eyes and yawned as they walked out of the door of the inn. They did not remember the name of the inn. They found a kind-looking old woman on the street and asked for directions. Then they walked toward the South City. They asked for directions again and again through the alleys and streets, and finally saw two big locust trees. From the moment they saw the locust trees, memories that should have been vague but were actually very clear flooded into Ning Kai's mind. He closed his eyes and thought for a while, and then walked over with Sang Sang. There was a quiet alley between the two big locust trees. It was wide enough for a horse carriage to pass, but it did not look luxurious. There was no sound coming from the houses on both sides of the street. Many towering trees stretched out from the walls of the courtyards, covering the heads of people in twos and threes. The trees covered the spring sunshine and gave the place a cool shade. They walked to the middle of the alley and saw two mansions facing each other. The stone lion on the right side of the steps was very clean, with no obvious dust or fallen leaves on it. The red door was tightly shut, and the brass ring was silent. On the other hand, the one on the left was in a much more dilapidated state. The paint on the door was peeling off, and the two seals were floating weakly in the wind. There was only one stone lion left, and the other one had been moved somewhere. Even the one that was left was already dilapidated. It was missing an ear and a claw, and the back of the pedestal was covered in black mud that somewhat resembled congealed blood. Ning Zhiyong looked at the broken stone lion in front of him, and remembered the time when he played with Xiao Shun beside the lion when they were young, and then they were punished by the adults in the mansion. Then they walked through the alley, and he seemed to see the scene when he bravely ran away from home with the little guy to avoid the teacher's wooden board when he was 4 years old. Song Song's eyes moved back and forth between the two doors and Ning Kai's face. She felt that he was gloomy and sad at the moment. She did not know why, but she also felt sad and felt that the wind in the alley was a little cold. That dilapidated yard was the mansion of the former Xianwei general, Lin Guangyuan. In the first year of the Tianqi era, when the emperor was inspecting the southern swamp, a case of treason broke out in Chang'an. The prince personally presided over the trial, with the prime minister and other ministers watching from the side. In the end, Lin Guangyuan was convicted of treason, and the whole Lin family was executed. This case had long been treated as an ironclad case, and no one in the imperial court thought of reversing the verdict. Even if some people remembered the incident, they would occasionally think of the servants and stewards who should not have died. They would feel sorry for them and hate Lin Guangyuan even more. This man had committed a heinous crime. Not only had he caused his own death, but he had also implicated so many innocent people. In the 10 years after the general's mansion was taken back by the imperial court, it had been bestowed several times. However, when the officials who received the bestowment heard that it was a dangerous place, they all politely declined. There were many large mansions in Chang'an, so they were not afraid of not having a place to live. However, as a result, this mansion had long been empty in this street, and it had become more and more dilapidated. When walking through the gate of the general's mansion, Ning Kai's eyes flashed with sadness, and no other strange emotions could be seen on his face. He did not stop, and even his footsteps did not slow down. He was still walking as usual, so Sang Sang, who was carrying the big black umbrella, had to keep up with him as usual. The big black umbrella bounced off the little girl's back and then fell back, making a pa sound like a drum that represented the passage of time. The two of them walked calmly through the long alley, between the vermilion door and the broken door. They were like two ordinary tourists who had mistakenly entered a street in Chang'an in spring. No one wants that haunted house, but the house opposite is very popular. Why? Back then, the Xianwei general and the Minister of Council lived opposite each other. The Xianwei general's entire family was executed, but the Minister of Council rose to the top and is now a scholar of the Imperial Library. How many 4th and 5th ranked officials would want to take advantage of the mansion he once lived in? At the corner of a restaurant at the end of the street, Ning Ke and Sang Sang sat at a small table in the corner, quietly eating dishes and drinking porridge, but listening to the idle chatter of the old neighbors. For these old neighbors who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, or even generations, the most worthwhile things for them to talk about were naturally the treason case of the general's mansion and the path of the official of council. They did not get tired of talking about these things every day, which suited the master and servant's wishes. Speaking of scholar Xing Jing, he was just an official of council back then, but then he suddenly rose rapidly. There's a wonderful thing about this, I wonder if you've heard of it. Back then, this matter was so big that even the palace made a statement. Who in this market hasn't heard of it? A middle-aged man shook his head and said sarcastically, a dignified official of council married a fierce wife. The wife of the legal wife, out of jealousy, even tried to hurt the concubine's belly. That's not surprising. As a result, the concubine went through all kinds of hardships to give birth, and she still wanted to hurt the poor child. In the end, if the palace didn't issue an order, who knows what would have happened in the mansion. You only know that the palace issued an order, but do you know who did it? The man who spoke earlier sneered and bowed toward the north of Chang and city. Let me tell you, it was the Empress Saint Emperor who flew into a rage after knowing about this. She personally wrote a letter to Lord Xing Jing, ordering him to discipline his wife. Her Majesty, the people who were drinking at the table looked at each other and smiled knowingly. Everyone in the world knew that the Tang Empire had an extremely great empress who was deeply loved and trusted by His Majesty. She even had the power to read memorials and judge officials. However, this empress was just a very ordinary concubine in the palace. In the words of the common people, she was His Majesty's concubine, and later remarried and became the legal wife. With such a background, everyone could guess the reason why the empress was so concerned about the affairs of the official of council's mansion and was so angry because the official's wife abused his concubine and murdered her child. Lord Xing Jing's legal wife was born in a prominent family in Qinghe Prefecture, and it was precisely because of this that he had been tolerating her. However, he didn't expect that the cowardly civil official in the eyes of others could be so ruthless. After the Empress's letter was sent to the mansion, Lord Xing Jing gathered his family that very night and publicly beat 3 stewards who murdered his concubine's child. Then he sent his wife back to Qinghe Prefecture with 2 slaps and a small sedan chair. He divorced his wife so cleanly. Speaking of which, the reason why the official was so decisive back then was probably because he had no choice but to protect himself under the Empress's power. However, he didn't expect that he would do it so cleanly that he won the favor of the Empress. She felt that he was a useful person, and because of some other reasons, the official was able to become an official and is now in the Imperial Library. It is said that fortune and misfortune come hand in hand, but who would dare to imagine that having a fierce wife who killed his concubine and son would eventually lead to a man's official career? Chapter 30. Everyone around the table sighed. Ning Ke and Sang Sang sat in the corner, playing with the shredded pickles in the plate and listening silently. The sound of them drinking porridge was also very sad. He didn't have much of an impression of Sir Xing Jing, but he had a deep impression of his wife who was as fierce as a tiger. He didn't know who was right or wrong in this family fight that had spread to the palace. Anyway, it had nothing to do with him. He was more concerned about the situation in the First Minister's mansion. Compared with Lord Xing Jing, General Lin Guanyuan is really unlucky. That's not right. He dared to commit treason, so he should die 1,000 times. But the people in the mansion are really pitiful. The old man picked up the tip of his chopsticks and broke the salted egg on the plate. He drank a mouthful of the cheap lotus white inside. None of you have seen it with your own eyes. I happened to be there that day. The sound of killing shook the heavens in the general's mansion. Heads fell like watermelons falling to the ground. That blood overflowed from under the door. I don't want to speak for the traitor. It's just that sometimes I feel sad when I think about it. At that time, the neighbors all knew that there were several officials in the imperial court who were good friends with Xianwei general. But after the incident, no one stood up for the general, and no one even collected the corpse. The old man put down his wine cup and looked around the restaurant subconsciously. He looked at the street outside the door and said in a low voice, "Have you heard of Huang Xing, the city gate officer? He was brought back by Xianwei general from the frontier fortress. He was the one who first accused the general of treason. Where is he now? He has joined the prince and is doing well now. And the Zhaowu commandant is said to be doing well now. I don't know if these people will think of the heads in Xianwei general's mansion when they are indulging in debauchery every day. If so, how do they feel?" The chopsticks dipped into the egg yolk and ate the wine. Although it was slow, it was still finished. The idlers around the table drank up the daily lotus white wine set by the fierce wife at home. Then they stopped chatting and bid farewell with a smile. Ning Ke and Sang Sang were still sitting at the small table in the corner. The porridge on the table was already cold. The edges of the pickled cabbage were blown by the wind, but they obviously had no intention of leaving. "Young master, what is your relationship with the general's mansion?" Sang Sang looked at him and asked seriously. Ning Ke answered with a smile, "Of course. I'm asking, what's the relationship, not whether there's a relationship or not," Sang Sang corrected her seriously. After a moment of silence, Ning Ke gradually stopped smiling and said seriously, "But I can't tell you about this relationship. You're my maid now." Chapter 31. In the 6th year of the Tianqi era, the Tang Empire and the Yan Kingdom went to war. General Xiahou led the right army and did not arrive on time and was severely reprimanded by the imperial court. General Xiahou reported that they encountered the Yan Kingdom's ambush at the Yellow Wind Ridge and the right army killed them before chasing after them. The people in Chang and did not know that the Yan cavalry that Xiahou led on the right side of the army and killed were actually the border residents of the Yellow Wind Ridge. Several villages were slaughtered by the right side of the army and Xiahou used the heads of the strong men of the villagers to pretend to be the leader of the cavalry. After that, he pushed the responsibility of the villages to the Yan Kingdom. The massacre of an entire village was a big deal anywhere, especially in the Tang Empire. Therefore, the imperial court did not believe Xiahou's explanation and sent competent officials to investigate. However, those villages had already been massacred and there was no witness. The investigating officials also had some problems. Therefore, the imperial court later concluded that Xiahou was telling the truth. Because of the massacre, the Yan kingdom sacrificed a large piece of fertile land in the west of the river and sent the crown prince as a hostage to barely appease the Tang Empire's anger. However, not many people knew that the villagers who had their heads chopped off and burned were crying in the underworld. No one knew that a dark and thin teenager had escaped from the village. That dark and thin teenager was Joyer. He met Ning Ke by the Min Mountain and was taken away by a cultivator. Until today. Hey, what state are you in now? No doubt state or see-through state? Yo, a cultivation idiot like you actually knows about states? Of course. Cultivation is such a simple thing. It's very stupid. Ning Ke was actually just showing off the knowledge he had just learned in front of a friend whom he had not met for a long time. See-through state my ass. My poor but respectable master had just stepped into the no doubt state on the day he died. As for the poor and sad me, I'm still struggling in the initial state. Otherwise, I wouldn't need to be **King spy. Ning Ke looked at him mockingly and said, I really don't know what that old man saw in you back then. I begged him to go with me, but he didn't want me. Instead, he saw you as a silly charcoal head. Surprisingly, Joyer didn't refute. After a long silence, he said, "Little Ning, in fact, I've been thinking that I didn't learn anything from my master. You're so smart. If you followed my master at that time, would it have been better? At least, you wouldn't be like me now. I've been in the army for so many years, but I still haven't been able to get close to Xiahou. I can't get any news from the upper echelons no matter how hard I ask." Ning Ke looked at him quietly and suddenly laughed. He said, "Who said you didn't find out anything? At least now we know how many times Xiahou goes to the bathroom a day, don't we? These things won't help in killing him." "It's helpful." Ning Ke looked into his eyes seriously and said, "On the way here, I killed a group of Xiahou's assassins. It's all thanks to the information you've given me all these years." Joyer was very clear about the strength of the assassins under Xiahou's command. He looked at the lad in front of him in shock. He couldn't understand what kind of adventure this lad had encountered in the 7 years that he hadn't seen him. How could he be able to do such a thing? However, he didn't voice out the doubts in his heart. He just smiled and asked, "How does it feel to kill Xiahou's men for the first time?" "It feels good." Ning Ke recalled the feeling when he slashed out 3 times and said slowly. Suddenly, he frowned and stared at Joyer's dark face. He said, "It won't be good if people find out about our relationship. Chang'an is very big. Don't think that you can see enemies all the time. Moreover, you should understand one thing. To those bigwigs, the people of the general's mansion are all dead, and our village has also been slaughtered. Therefore, you and I are people who don't exist. Naturally, no one will be wary of us. Speaking of which, you're the official handyman of General Xiahou's bodyguard team. How did you suddenly become the golden hatchet man of the goldfish gang?" "I followed my boss back to the capital to report on my work. I didn't expect the military to ask me to be a spy. Besides, our gang isn't called the Goldfish Gang. It's called the Fish Dragon Gang. My boss asked me to keep an eye on our gang leader because some people suspect that he has something to do with the Yueluan Kingdom. You know, many businesses of the nobles in the imperial court, even the transportation of military supplies, sometimes rely on these gangs to maintain order. If they collude with the enemy country, there will be serious problems." "Our gang leader?" Ning Ke frowned and looked at him. He said, "There's something wrong with these 4 words. It means that you respect this gang leader very much. You've even treated yourself as a popular hatchet man in the gang. Darky, you have to wake up. Although I've never been an undercover, I've seen a lot. I know that you can't get emotional when you're an undercover. Once you get emotional, you'll end up in a miserable state. Our gang leader is a good man." Joyer lowered his head and kept silent for a long time. Then he raised his head and looked at Ning Ke seriously. He said, "Actually, he should have seen through my identity, but he didn't do anything to me." Ning Ke wanted to persuade him further, but Joyer raised his right hand and firmly refused. He said, "He's my big brother, a big brother whom I respect very much. You don't have to persuade him anymore. On the contrary, I have something to ask of you. If anything happens to me in the future, I hope that you can repay my big brother's kindness when it's convenient for you." Ning Ke was silent and looked at him quietly. He didn't know what had happened in the biggest gang in Chang'an, but he could tell that Joyer was serious. He couldn't help but be curious about his big brother. What kind of Jianhu bigshot was that Joyer was so convinced that he couldn't repay his big brother's kindness even after his death? At the end of their first conversation after 7 years, the two of them briefly talked about the recent situation. After hearing about the assassination on Northern Mountain Road, Joyer was shocked and asked, "It's such a good opportunity. Why don't you get in touch with the princess? Even if her social class is too far apart from ours, as long as you bring out the same stubbornness that you used to pester my master, who in this world can refuse you? Ning Ke shook his head and said firmly, no. The princess seems to be wise and thoughtful, but she's actually a naive, stupid, and idiotic idiot. If I follow her, I might lose my life at any time. They parted at the small restaurant. Ning Ke and Sang Sang left first and began to ask for directions again and again. When they were about to reach the market where the inn was located, it began to rain. With a bang, the big black umbrella bloomed over their heads like a black lotus, shielding them from the rain. Sang Sang held the umbrella handle tightly with both hands, raised her little face, and asked in confusion, "Why do you always say that the princess is an idiot? In fact, she's really a good person." Really a good person. Ning Ke looked at the road in the rain and shook his head slowly. The Vermilion Bird Avenue, which led directly to the Imperial Palace in the north, was originally gray, but became black after being soaked by the rain. Ning Ke and Sang Sang stood on the side of the road and looked at it. They only felt like a black, long, and straight ribbon, which was worn on the chest of the magnificent Chang'an city. It was elegant, solemn, and frightening, especially the vermilion bird carved in the middle of the avenue. Its two eyes stared at them without anger, as if it was about to fly up from among the stones and pounce on them. Under the black umbrella, the master and the handmaiden felt the ancient murderous intent at the same time. Fear surged out from the deepest part of their bodies. Their hands that were holding each other instantly became extremely cold, and they were so stiff that they couldn't move. Holding the big black umbrella, they struggled to stand on the side of the road for a long time. They didn't come to their senses until the wind and rain finally stopped. The sun shone on the long street again, and the pedestrians walked around them. Looking at it, the vermilion bird deeply engraved on the imperial road did not change at all. No matter whether he could figure it out in the future or not, at least this day's experience finally made him feel the lofty status of the academy in the Tang Empire. He also realized the respect and even awe the imperial court had for the academy. It was just a simple certificate of eligibility for the academy entrance examination, but it required 3 of the 6 departments to stamp it. Furthermore, only officials above the rank of Lang Zhong were qualified to do this. In the military ministry, the Ministry of Personnel, and the Ministry of Rights, Ning Ke had seen more officials above the 5th rank today than he had seen in the past 16 years. If not for the fact that his military status had not been changed to civilian status, he would even need to go to the Yamen of the Ministry of Revenue. Although the spring day was warm and pleasant, he was still sweating profusely after going through so much trouble in the north city of Chang'an. He could not help but think that even if the imperial court wanted to send troops to the South Jin Kingdom, they would not need to go through so much trouble. The imperial ministry was a place with a strict hierarchy. Ning Ke was just a small soldier from a border town with no background. He had thought that he would be treated with contempt and coldness. However, when the officials saw his name, they did not make things difficult for him as General Ma Shixiang had warned them. They just waved their hands and let him pass. Ning Ke thought about it carefully and realized that the princess had sent someone to greet him. The princess had returned from the grassland and encountered an assassination on her way back. When she returned to Chang'an, she must have been congratulated by hundreds of officials, held a banquet in the palace, and secretly investigated. If it had been someone else, they would have been very grateful for him. However, he did not think so, because this was something that he had previously discussed with Her Highness. Although they had discussed it beside the fire, Her Highness did not act like a highness. After stamping the last stamp in the Ministry of Rights, the sun had already begun to set in the west. Fortunately, the Tang Empire's bureaucracy was not too bureaucratic and was quite efficient. The Yamen responsible for issuing the certificate of eligibility for the academy entrance examination was not far from the Ministry of Rights, and it was still open at this time. There were 2 or 3 young people who had just received the certificate and were whispering at the door. It's not a good idea to stay in and in all the time. I can't get to know my classmates. It's not bad to move to the academy in advance. Maybe I can get to know some senior brothers and sisters. It's not cheap to live in the academy. It's even more expensive than the best ULI in Chang'an. Speaking of which, it was better during the time of Emperor Taizu. At that time, the academy didn't have to pay for food and accommodation. There's no need to save money. In my opinion, it's good to go to the academy one day earlier. If you can familiarize yourself with the environment, you will have a higher chance of passing the academy entrance examination. I heard that the military ministry went crazy this time and recommended more than 70 candidates. Ning Kai was about to walk inside when he suddenly stopped and looked at the young scholar with hands folded in front. He asked, "Brother, did you just say that the academy doesn't provide food and accommodation now?" The three people looked at Ning Kai as if they were looking at an idiot. They probably wanted to say, "If you don't even know this, why do you want to enter the academy?" Ning Kai's favorite thing to do was to laugh at others for being idiots behind their backs. At this time, when someone said he was an idiot to his face, he naturally could not accept it, so he turned around and entered the door. When he came out again, the young scholars at the door were long gone. Otherwise, they would definitely mock him when they saw his pale face. Sang Sang had been waiting outside the door. She held the big black umbrella to block the sun from making her face darker. She was squinting at the good idea when she suddenly saw Ning Kai's appearance. She suddenly became nervous and trotted to him. She asked in a trembling voice, "What's wrong? The academy doesn't allow students to bring their handmaidens. Did you tell the adults inside that I can help the academy as long as I have a place to live? That's not the problem." Ning Kai's lips were a little dry. He looked at her and said in a slightly hoarse voice, "I just asked clearly. The academy doesn't provide food and accommodation at all. That means if I pass the exam, I have to pay 30 taels of silver every month, 30 taels of silver." Sang Sang subconsciously raised her voice and screamed, "Then what's the point of studying?" She knew it was meaningless when she said this. She frowned and looked at Ning Kai bitterly. She said, "Young master, we have saved 76 taels of silver these years. We didn't spend a single copper coin on the way with the princess. Including the money from selling the carriage, the general's financial support and the gambling debts, we have less than 200 taels of silver. After arriving in Chang'an, we stayed in the inn for 2 days and had 5 meals." Ning Kai stopped the little handmaiden's nagging and said uneasily, "The academy entrance exam will be held in a month. It seems that we have to stay in the inn for a month. You have to include this expense." If Sang Sang could see her face at this time, she would feel a little happier. Because her little black face had become much paler because of shock and uneasiness. "I don't like it either. It's too bitter." Ning Kai stopped smiling. He looked at the pedestrians in the rain and pretended to be calm. He said, "Actually, I was joking." Sang Sang looked up at his chin. After hesitating for a long time, she plucked up her courage and said, "Young master, there's actually a very simple way to make money. I just don't know if you're willing to do it." Ning Kai turned his head and instantly felt that the little handmaiden's little black face had become more pleasing to the eye and beautiful than ever. He said gently, "Nowadays, as long as I can make money, there's nothing I'm not willing to do." Sang Sang replied, "Young master, your calligraphy is so good. Let's sell your calligraphy." Ning Kai's expression froze. He looked at her and said seriously, "Sang Sang, you've become uglier." Sang Sang was confused. Ning Kai scolded angrily, "What do you mean by selling calligraphy? That's calligraphy. Do you know what calligraphy is? How can you sell the things of a scholar? I'd rather sell my body than sell it." Sang Sang shouted angrily, "Young master, you're not a scholar. You're just a woodcutter. Don't you always say that you're better at writing than killing people? Since you're willing to kill people to make money, why can't you make money by writing? Ning Ke retorted weakly without much confidence, I've said that's not writing, it's called calligraphy. He lowered his head and looked at his shoes that were wet from the rain. He looked at the words that he had just written with the rainwater from the black umbrella. He knew that he had lost to the little handmaiden once again in life. The line of words written with rainwater was as follows, don't worry about being poor, worry about having a fierce maid at home. On the wooden shelves on the east wall, there were things like writing brushes, ink, paper, and grinders. The most satisfying thing was that there was a house at the back of the shop, and there was a well in the small house at the back. Ning Ke and Sang Sang looked around casually. Thinking of the low rent, they were somewhat willing. I don't want these paintings. You'll have to reduce the transfer fee. Ning Ke looked at the wall full of scrolls and the shabby handwriting on the scrolls. He frowned and said, although those brushes, ink, paper, and inkstones are not good things, they can still be used. I'll take them as a gift from you. Sang Sang looked up at Ning Ke with an admiring smile, thinking that the young master's words were very well said. The steward wanted to cry but had no tears. He thought to himself, I already know how stingy you two are these days, but I didn't expect you to be so stingy. I'm just a steward, not your enemy. What's the point of torturing me? After torturing and torturing, the matter was finally settled. Sang Sang took out a silver box from her bag and carefully counted it for a long time before handing over the agreed amount of silver. They signed a document. From this moment on, the small calligraphy shop on Lin 47th Street in the Eastern District officially belonged to Ning Quebec. After sending off the steward with a smile, Sang Sang put down her bag and took out a handkerchief to cover her head and face. She also took out a big towel from somewhere and fetched a bucket of well water from the back of the house, ready to start cleaning. Thinking that they might have to sign the document today, the two checked out of the inn and carried their luggage here. They would not hesitate to save a days in fee. The steward obviously didn't notice this detail. Otherwise, he might have asked for a higher price, but it was more likely that he would be scared out of his wits by this stingy pair of master and servant. The small calligraphy shop was filled with the smell of dust and water. The thin Sang Sang laboriously moved the bucket of water, set up a stool, and squatted down to clean the shop. Occasionally, she raised her arm to wipe her forehead, which was not covered by the handkerchief, although there was no sweat on it. Ning Ke had never cared about such things. He took a stool and sat by the door. Looking at the corner of the imperial city that could be vaguely seen in the distance, the quiet Lin 47th Street, and the shadows of the locust trees on both sides of the street, he thought that the shop would definitely have a good business in the future. Moreover, he had only spent so little money. He could not help but feel gratified and shouted with a smile, "Young master, your hands are itching." The busy Sang Sang was obviously in a good mood today. She answered crisply, "Let's do it tonight." Okay. After a hasty dinner, Sang Sang spread out a roll of paper on the long, polished table. She took out an ink ingot and an ink stone, poured water into the ink stone, rolled up her sleeves, lifted her wrist, and slowly drew circles on the ink stone. Soon, the ink became thicker. Everything was left by the previous owner. Although it was not good, it was complete. Ning Ke was already waiting by the side with a brush in his hand. On the brush holder in front of his right hand, there were 5 or 6 brushes, the tip of which could not be seen clearly. The inferior ink did not have any fragrance when it melted, but had a slight odor. The brushes on the brush holder did not look good either, but he did not care about it. His face was full of an expectant smile, and he kept rubbing the thumb and index finger of his left hand behind his waist, as if itching. The so-called itching did not mean that he wanted to steal money, nor did he want to spank the little handmaiden's skinny butt. He just wanted to write. Ning Ke liked to write. Even if there was no paper, ink, brush, or inkstone beside him, but only a withered branch or a big black umbrella soaked in rain, he would write on the mud or bluestone from time to time. For the past 16 years, the enjoyment of writing was undoubtedly the most important thing in his life, along with meditation. Ning Ke dragged the brush into the ink slowly and absorbed enough ink until he was full of energy. Then he stood shoulder to shoulder, quietly looking at the roll of paper in front of him. He lifted the brush out of the inkstone like a sharp knife out of its sheath, and his pen fell into the paper like a knife cutting into the bone. With a slight movement of his wrist, a vertical line appeared on the paper. This vertical line was like a thick eyebrow of a big man with thick eyebrows. With the first touch of the broken paper, his pen's momentum paused and then mellowed. Over the years, the line of writing had already been deeply ingrained in his bone marrow and blood. He did not need to deliberately plan and manage it. He could naturally write on the paper as long as he casually did it. As the tip of the brush gradually moved to the left, a clumsy but free aura leaped out. The first piece of calligraphy he wrote in Chang and only had 16 words. The mountains are high and the rivers are long, and there are thousands of things. If I didn't have an old brush, I would be poor. Chapter 35. Ning Ke's ideal life was to have a good brush, ink, paper, inkstone and a beautiful knight, a beautiful handmaiden by his side, a cup of tea in front of him, 3 burning incense sticks by the table and a bright moon outside the window. He could roll up his sleeves to write as much as he wanted, and when he was done, he could raise his head and flick his fingers to send a handleless flying sword to kill a general from thousands of miles away. This was Ning Ke's ideal life. On the first night in the house on Lin 47th Street, he felt that he was infinitely close to his ideal. Although the brush, ink, paper and inkstone were all cheap goods, although the night was silent but not spacious, although there was only clear water without tea, only porridge and sesame seed cake on the table without burning incense, although there was still no bright moon outside the window, although the handmaiden was too small, too dark and too ugly, and although he now felt that cultivation was a very stinky and hollow fart, although there were so many ifs, he still felt very happy when he could write freely on the snow-white paper. He even thought that Song Song's idea of selling calligraphy was really a genius. The city of Wei was bitter and cold, not poor, but not rich either. The materials transported by the military ministry did not include brush, ink, paper and inkstone. Therefore, it used to cost a lot of money to write a few scrolls of calligraphy. Now, he could use the brush, ink, paper and inkstone freely and could even exchange them for money. Sang Sang would not complain in a low voice. Was there anything happier in the world? Painful and torturous time always passed like a year, but happy and enjoyable time was really fleeting. When he finally raised his head, picked up the bowl and drank half of the water, rubbed his sore wrists and shoulders, and decided to take a rest, it was already dawn outside the door. There was a faint sound of pouring water and hawking coming from afar. After writing for a whole night, there were already many scrolls of paper around him. Except for the 2 cursive works at the beginning to vent his emotions, he wrote the rest of the works honestly. He wrote what Sang Sang thought would sell well. It seemed that there was no plan, but in fact, there were vertical scrolls, horizontal scrolls, long scrolls and even a large central hall, but it had not been mounted yet. The scrolls of paper at the foot of the table seemed to be ink papers of different shapes and sizes. Ning Ke had practiced hard for many years and copied thousands of scrolls, so he was very confident in his handwriting. However, he could not use those skills that he was most confident and proud of in Chang and city. Otherwise, if the onlookers asked him which year was the 9 years of Yonghe and what was the Kuaiji mountain, how could he answer them? Therefore, he could only copy some poetry collections from the present world, as well as some widely circulated scriptures. However, he believed that even so, after these scrolls of paper were hung on the wall, there would definitely be countless high-ranking officials, nobles, celebrities, and scholars with discerning eyes, who would come after hearing the news. Aya, the threshold will be broken in 2 days. Looks like we have to prepare for repairs in advance. Ning Ke thought proudly. He stretched his right hand to the wall and tore down the paper roll left by the former owner as if he was pulling out a pile of garbage. When he was about to ask Sang Sang to find a framing shop to hang up his masterpiece, he found that the little handmaiden had fallen asleep in the corner of the room, hugging her knees. I was just about to ask you to buy 2 bowls of Chang En's famous hot and sour noodles to try. He looked at the little lass who was sleeping soundly and couldn't help but shake his head. He took a short shirt and covered her body with it. Then, he pushed open the door and walked out. Under the comfortable morning light, he followed the alluring scent of green onions and the hawkers. "Uncle, how much for a bowl of noodles?" "So expensive?" "Look, my shop is over there, and we are all neighbors. How about a cheaper price?" Yes, that's the shop. I haven't named it yet. I've already thought of a name. I just need to make a signboard." "What name?" "Old Brush Pen Shop." In order to get close to the hawker and buy 2 bowls of cheap hot and sour noodle soup, Ning Ke had randomly named the shop. This was somewhat unreasonable no matter how one looked at it. Therefore, Sang Sang had no idea about the shop's name, but she could not help mentioning her young master for several years because of this. All in all, this shop with a shopkeeper who was also a calligrapher, a handmaiden who was also a handyman, and such a strange name, had finally made its debut in Lin 47th Street. Ning Ke's only dissatisfaction with this shop was that it was too far from the framing shop, and framing was too slow. Unfortunately, he was not good at framing, so he had to wait patiently for another 2 days. One day, when it rained again in Chang'an, the shop on Lin 47th Street quietly opened for business. Ning Ke was wearing a brand new scholar's green robe, holding a cheap red clay teapot in his left hand. Standing behind the threshold in front of the wall full of books, he seemed to see a new life waving at him, and that new life was very handsome and pleasant. Spring rain is as precious as oil, a good sign. He sipped the tea, standing inside the threshold and looking at the wind and rain outside. He said with emotion, "The fragrance of tea and ink is intoxicating. It's really a grand undertaking. Talking and laughing is better than getting drunk in one's life." Chapter 36. When the shop opened, the first customer was the owner who was qualified to collect the rent. It did not seem to be a good sign. Ning Ke's mood did not become too bad after hearing such a troublesome insider news. He believed that a man who could own an entire street in Chang'an was either rich or had a powerful backer. Since the owner had made a promise to him, it was unnecessary for him to worry about other things. Since the old brush pen shop was the only tenant on this street, the middle-aged man generously said that he would waive the rent for 3 months before he left. That alone was enough to make the master and the servant happy. What really troubled him was the business that was as miserable as a cold spring breeze. The spring rain in Chang'an lasted for 4 or 5 days in a row, pitter-patter, as if there was no end to it. The air was cold and the road was wet and slippery, so people were naturally reluctant to go out. Now, only his shop was open on this long street. The doors of the shops in the front and back of the street were tightly closed, so there was no way for people to gather. Therefore, it seemed more and more deserted. Apart from 2 or 3 groups of people, there were only a few sparrows jumping on their little feet. How could there be any business? On the first day of opening, Ning Ke had always said that the spring rain was as precious as oil, but now it had become as cheap as urine. He sat on a round chair with a long ledge and looked at the rain outside the shop, sighing again and again. If a person's gaze could really have power, and if he was a grand cultivator or psyche master who had entered the knowing destiny state, his resentful gaze was enough to directly tear down the grey wall. The middle-aged man said that both sides of Lynn 47th Street were his shops, but not the grey wall opposite the old brush pen shop. Behind that grey wall was the warehouse of the Ministry of Personnel, which needed to be expanded. That was one of the reasons why Ning Kei was unhappy. At noon, someone finally stepped into the deserted shop. It was a fat man with a big belly who looked like a rich businessman and two attendants. Ning Kei had thought that they had ill intentions and might be black-faced lobbyists hired by the Imperial Demolition Department, so he inevitably became vigilant. After listening to a few words, he realized that they were just two idlers who were taking a stroll to hide from the rain. Since they were idlers, Ning Kei naturally did not bother to get up to greet them. He held the teapot of poor-quality red clay in both hands and looked at the curtain of rain outside the shop. His eyes were slightly open as if he was about to fall asleep, but in fact, his heart was already swollen from wanting to make money. The fat tycoon put his hands behind his back and put his face close to the wall to look carefully. For some unknown reason, the few people who entered the old brush pen shop these days habitually put their hands behind their backs, as if they wanted to show that they had good eyesight. The rich man had lived in Chang'an for a long time. He had been an artsy person for many years, so he had developed some discerning eyes. After looking for a while, he said to the attendant beside him, "You don't say. I can't believe there are some good words in such a shabby place." This sentence should be regarded as a compliment, but it seemed a little frivolous and condescending. Of course, such a tone could not arouse the feelings of Ning Kei's bosom friend. He still sat in the round chair, seemingly unconcerned, but in fact, his ears were pricked up, carefully listening to what this rich man would say next, hoping to sell the first piece of calligraphy. "Young man, who wrote these words in the shop?" the fat millionaire turned around and asked. "I wrote it." Ning Kei leaned forward slightly and responded politely. The fat millionaire did not say anything more. After looking for a while, he shook his head and sighed regretfully, "Tsk. What a pity, what a pity. There are a few pieces of calligraphy that can be called beautiful, but it's a pity that the writer is still young and forced himself to pretend to be a great calligrapher. Well, since you can see it today, you're lucky. San-air, take down this piece of calligraphy, I want it." Ning Kei turned to the three people and asked, "Sir, how much do you want to pay for it?" "This piece of calligraphy can be sold for at most 500 copper coins in a stall outside the fragrance workshop. Since you have the shop's fees, and since you're young, I'll give you 2 taels of silver." The rich man said with a smile. Ning Kei picked up the teapot and drank some tea, then put it down and scolded, "Get lost." The rich man's expression suddenly changed, and he scolded angrily, "Young man, how can you not know how to appreciate favors? I'm young, but I can't be bullied." Ning Kei shook his head and replied, "When you said that I was young and forced myself to pretend to be a great calligrapher, I was ready to ask you to get lost. I just wanted to see what your price was. If your price was high enough, I don't mind letting you humiliate me. But it's a pity that your price is not enough to humiliate me." The livid rich man flicked his sleeves and left with his entourage. Sang Sang, who had rolled up her sleeves and was washing vegetables, rushed out of the backyard. Looking at the 3 figures that had long disappeared in the rain, her face was full of regret and unwillingness. She twisted her body and stared at Ning Kei, who was sitting in the chair, and said angrily, "Young master, that's 2 taels of silver." The sale of 2 ingots of ink and 3 pieces of writing paper was all the income of the old brush pen shop since its opening. Although the middle-aged man had waived their rent for 3 months, Sang Sang could not sleep well every night when she thought of the terrible expenses of the academy in the future. No wonder she was so angry about the previous scene. Since there was no more business, Ning Kei simply closed the shop after lunch, in the name of comforting the little handmaiden's seriously hurt heart. In fact, he probably just wanted to relax himself. He took Sang Sang through the streets and alleys to the legendary Chenjinji cosmetics store, and then bought some leisure books from a bookstore called Donghua Bookstore. The effect of relaxing was very good. Sang Sang carried the Tide books in one hand and the powder box of Chenjinji cosmetics store in the other. Her tanned face could not hide her joy. Ning Kei was also in a very good mood. He held the big black umbrella with his right hand and stretched out his left hand to catch the rainwater. The rainwater hit the umbrella in his palm, and his boots stepped on the rainwater that had accumulated into small puddles. The master and the handmaiden hopped back to Lin 47th Street like two little sparrows. Suddenly, the black umbrella shook slightly. Ning Kei stood in the rain a dozen meters away from the shop and looked at the gray wall that had been washed black by the rainwater. He looked at the man sitting under the wall, and at the man's tanned face that had turned blue due to excessive blood loss. His right hand holding the handle of the umbrella suddenly tightened. The sound was like the beating of a war drum. His left foot suddenly stepped into the puddle on the bluestone, splashing water. He gathered all the strength in his body to his waist and was ready to rush down the gray wall. However, at this moment, the black-faced man covered in blood under the wall looked at him and forced a smile. Then he shook his head with unusual firmness. There was an extremely terrible wound on his chest and abdomen. His black clothes were torn, blood was flowing, and his bones were broken. Even those grand cultivators who had entered the state of no rules could not save him. Ning Kei saw this scene and understood his determination. Then he heard the dense footsteps and shouts from the entrance of the alley. So he slowly and clumsily withdrew his left foot, and his right hand holding the handle of the umbrella trembled violently for no reason. The military ministry is chasing the spy. Idlers, get out of the way. Dozens of Tang Yulin royal guards in full armor rushed into the alley in the rain and surrounded Joyer under the corner of the wall. They looked solemn and vigilant. The leading general was obviously relieved when he saw Joyer's injury. The spring rain was getting heavier and heavier, washing the gray wall even darker. The rainwater flowed down the wall like a stream and quickly washed away the blood stained by Joyer. Chapter 37. The Yulin royal guards had sealed off the Lin 47th Street, but more and more people of Chang'an were crowding around. They didn't care about the cold rain drenching their bodies. They looked at the black-faced man under the wall nervously, uneasily, excitedly, or pitifully, and guessed what had happened. Ning Kei stood in the rain with a black umbrella and looked at Joyer, who was sitting in the rain, through the crowd. His expression was calm and he looked very focused, as if he wanted to engrave that face in his mind forever. 7 years ago, when we met on Min Mountain, this face was already so dark. Why are you so dark? Darker than the bottom of a pot, darker than Sang Sang, and darker than the night. They hadn't seen each other for 7 years, but little Darky had become a black-faced man. After all, this face was still a little strange. So at this last moment, he had to look at it seriously and remember it firmly. Joyer, whose eyes were always closed, was carried out of Lin 47th Street by the sergeants of the Yulin Royal Guards. The onlookers dispersed, and Ning Kei and Sang Sang walked back to the shop under the black umbrella. He looked calm, but Sang Sang could clearly feel that there was no light in his eyes, as if he was a shell without a soul. After the shop door was closed, Ning Kei sat in the armchair and kept silent for a long time. Then he said in a low voice, "Let's have noodles tonight." "Okay." Sang Sang answered as fast as she could. She threw the book and makeup box aside and went into the backyard. After eating a bowl of noodles with 3 fried eggs specially made by Sang Sang, Ning Kei's mood seemed to have completely returned to normal. He even made fun of her after putting down the bowl and chopsticks, but his laughter was inevitably a little dry. In the dead of night, when the rain stopped, Ning Kei walked out of the shop. After making sure that no one was watching in the dark, he slowly walked to the grey wall opposite the shop and squatted down. He raised his arm and slowly stroked the wall. That guy's body temperature had long disappeared from the damp and cold wall. He didn't know why that guy came here when he was seriously injured and on the verge of death, what he wanted to tell him, how long he had waited in the cold rain, and what he was thinking when he waited. His slender fingers touched a brick and slightly froze. There was a very faint blood stain on the corner of the brick, as well as a very small mark. If he didn't touch it with his fingers, he would never be able to see it with his naked eyes. Walking back to the shop, Ning Kei handed a few pieces of thin paper soaked in oil to Sang Sang and told her to take good care of them. Then, he boiled a pot of water and scalded his feet. Then, he crawled into the damp and cool quilt. As usual, Sang Sang slept on the other side of the bed, curled up like a mouse. 7 years ago, I only stayed with him for a dozen days before he was taken away by his dead master. However, you don't remember those things. He didn't learn anything from that dead man all these years, and now he's just a spy for the military. He's not doing very well. We did exchange letters, but we only met again after 7 years. I don't know what kind of person he has become. It would be too pretentious to say that I have deep feelings for him. My relationship with him is one of mutual use. To be more precise, I used him to find out about Xia Ho's matters. But he died just like that. This is very troublesome. I'm the only one who knows about the massacre of those villages. Of course, I didn't count you in. Doesn't that mean that I'm the one responsible for it? But now I'm already in a lot of trouble. How can I have the energy to care about this? Sang Sang knew that he just needed to vent or convince himself. He didn't need anyone to talk to him, so she didn't speak and gradually fell asleep. Ning Kei couldn't fall asleep. He opened his eyes and looked at the stains formed by the rainwater in the corner of the room. Suddenly, he sat up, put on a thin cotton jacket and went to the small courtyard. He took out 3 old knives from the pile of firewood and lowered his head to sharpen them under the eaves of the well. After sharpening the knives, he still didn't feel sleepy. He walked to the shop and lit the lamp. He poured water to grind the ink and moistened the brush. Then, he tore a piece of paper at random and wrote a few lines of words with the ink splashing like the heavy rain in the daytime. Chasing is too cruel. My name is Mu Ju. The pain penetrates my heart and liver. The pain is unbearable. Unable to get the Mercedes-Benz, the sorrow deepens. Choking on the paper, I don't know what to say. Little Ning, I bow my head. There was no expression on Ning Kei's face. His eyes were calm, which formed a sharp contrast with the gradually bitter and agitated handwriting on the paper. Sang Sang didn't know when she got up from the bed. The little handmaiden stood beside him in a thin cotton jacket. She looked at the words silently and then raised her little face to look at him in doubt. These words were written by a predecessor. I'm just copying. Ning Kei explained, that predecessor's ancestral grave was dug up. Although it was restored immediately, he couldn't go back to see it. So he wrote these words in grief and anger. Sang Sang nodded, but judging from the perplexed look in her eyes, she probably still did not understand. Ning Kei smiled and did not explain further. He had copied this famous piece at least 10 times. Only tonight did he roughly understand what kind of pain could pierce through his heart and liver, and what kind of things could make people choke with emotions and not know what to say at the last moment. After daybreak, the rain stopped. The sun that had been washed by the spring rain was extraordinarily clear and beautiful. It shone on the quiet Lin 47th Street, painting all the eaves and the grey wall with a layer of beauty. The door of the old brush pen shop was wide open. Ning Kei sat in a round chair and read a leisurely book. Sometimes he frowned or smiled because of the contents of the book, and then he picked up the teapot and took a sip of tea. There was a piece of oil-soaked paper in the middle of the seemingly leisurely book. The words that would never be wet by the rain were very clear in the oil-soaked paper. He wasn't reading the book at this time, but he was looking at the paper. This piece of oil-soaked paper was stuffed into the brick before Joyer died. It recorded a few names and some information such as their whereabouts and hobbies. Ning Ke didn't know whether this paper had anything to do with Joyer's death. But at least he knew what he should do to make Joyer's death worthwhile or to make him happier after death. The first name on the oil-soaked paper was Zhang Yiqi. Zhang Yiqi was an assistant censor of the Imperial Censorate. He was responsible for inspecting the officials and impeaching those who violated the law. When Censor Zhang was still a supervising censor, he was responsible for the trial of Xianwei General Lin Guanyuan's treason. When he was promoted to the secretary of the Imperial Censorate, he was also one of the officials who investigated the village extermination case in the Yan territory. Rising from the 8th rank to the lower 6th rank in 13 years didn't seem like a good official career. But Ning Ke didn't care about this. He only cared about the role this person played in the two cases. General Xiahou could kill the enemy and get away from the village extermination case. This person obviously played the role of an imperial censor. Then, you should die. Chapter 38. The censorate's rank was not high, but its power was not small. The imperial censor of the 6th rank was considered an important figure in the Tang Empire's bureaucratic system. The places where such a person went in and out were heavily guarded. Whether it was the government office or the mansion, there would be many subordinates and guards around them. A poor young man who wanted to kill a censor in Chang'an, the capital of the Tang Empire, sounded like a fantasy. Moreover, it was a fantasy from the East, which was used to individual heroism. However, Ning Ke had never considered how to kill the censor. In his opinion, killing was the simplest thing in the world. His life began with a murder. Later, in the Min Mountain, the frontier fortress, the grassland, and the northern mountain road, countless beasts and humans fell under his blades and arrows. He only cared about one thing at the moment: how to kill the censor Zhang Yiqi without being discovered. No matter how much he trusted his killing skills, he knew that if he could not escape quickly, he would definitely die in front of the security yamen of the Tang Empire and the unfathomable powerhouses in Chang'an. There was very little information about Zhang Yiqi on the oil paper, which was not suitable for Ning Ke's plan, except for one: the censor, Zhang Yiqi, was a serious and upright person. However, it was said that he was secretly very lecherous and often visited brothels. However, he had a fierce wife and carried the censor's reputation, so he was very careful when he visited brothels. After all, Joyer was only a low-level spy in the military ministry. He had never found out which brothel he frequented. There are so many brothels in Chang'an. Which one would you go to? Ning Ke furrowed his brows and pondered hard. He discarded the idea of following the other party to the brothel. Since the professional spies of the military ministry could not find out where Zhang Yiqi's brothel was, this censor must have his own way of finding out. And the people of Chang'an who loved to chat in the tea-houses would not care much about the preferences of an official like him. Therefore, it was difficult for him to get what he wanted from the streets and alleys. Things had become a little troublesome. Propping up his chin, he stared blankly at the clear sun after the rain for a long time. Suddenly, he stood up. At this moment, he was suddenly enlightened. He finally understood that this matter was no different from hunting in the Min Mountain or chopping firewood in the grassland. Since he wanted to know where the old bear and the horse gang were, but there was no good hunter-general to provide him with a map, the only thing he could do was to walk into the Min Mountain and the grassland with his own feet. He could see the worn marks on the bark, the dried feces in the weeds, and the ashes of the bonfire buried under the mud. He was a good hunter and an excellent woodchopper. Through these details, he was able to determine where the old bear was hiding and whether it had been injured. He was able to determine how many horse gang members there were and whether they had left Shubi Lake. Then he believed that he would be able to determine the habits of a Tang censor through the details he had personally observed and find a way to kill him silently. What he needed to do now was to enter Chang'an City. "I'm going out for a walk." Ning Kai stretched himself and said to Sang Sang. Then he walked out. Sang Sang ran to the door and asked, "Where are you going? Do you want me to go with you?" Ning Kai understood what she was worried about. He answered with a smile, "There are some places that you can't go with me." Walking on the sunny streets of Chang'an, Ning Kai's mood became better. He deliberately forgot about the blood in the spring rain, and then turned himself into a young scholar traveling abroad to study. He first went to the bookstore to return the few books that he had finished reading, and then began to wander between the censorate and the Zhang mansion. The next day, he walked under the shade of the willow tree and stood beside the sugar figurine stall. He watched from afar through the crowd as the square-faced, majestic censor walked out of the censorate and returned to his own mansion. Looking at the censor's strong entourage, the well-disciplined public security army in the streets, and the Yulin Royal Guards cavalry that occasionally galloped past him, Ning Kai was more and more certain that he could not use such a reckless method as killing people on the street. The whole day seemed to be fruitless. In the evening, the door of the Zhang mansion opened. The censor seemed to be attending an official banquet. The censor's wife and a few women dressed as concubines saw him off. The idlers on the street laughed and pointed at the place and said envious words. Ning Kai, who was drinking herbal tea in the tea shop, noticed some details. Apart from the cold and skinny wife, the other concubines were all extremely plump. Men's taste for women was never reflected through their wives, but through their concubines or lovers. Sometimes, men married because of their family status, money, prospects, and maybe love. But the reason why they took in concubines or lovers was very simple. It was purely to match their sexual desires. "I like plump girls." Ning Kai smiled and thought to himself as he looked at the concubines who stood obediently behind their mistress like quails. Their eyes revealed pride and slyness from time to time. Following the censor's sedan chair for 4 streets, Ning Kai watched as the sedan chair entered a majestic prince's mansion. He quietly looked at the door of the prince's mansion, then turned around and walked to a crowded place. He found an idler and asked, "My friend, I want to know if there are any brothels in Chang'an where the girls are known for their plump bodies." This question was very stupid, but after handing over a piece of silver, even the stupidest question could get a not-so-stupid answer. In the eyes of the idler, Ning Kai suddenly became a rich and tender scholar who came to Chang'an from another place. After making fun of him, Ning Kai held the teapot and introduced the brothels in Chang'an to him with great professionalism. Hearing the names that were even more complicated than the academy entrance examination, Ning Kai rubbed his eyebrows and said with a bitter smile, "There are too many. Say, which ones are the most expensive? And the environment must be quiet." Holding the names and addresses of a few famous brothels, Ning Kai searched the brightly lit streets of Chang'an. He lingered and hesitated in those romantic places. He did not enter some of the brothels. Just by looking at the appearance and the surrounding environment, he was sure that the censor was definitely not a regular customer. This was purely a hunter's intuition. The problem was that he was really not good at hunting in such places. He felt a little embarrassed that he did not enter the brothels after being politely invited by the pimps at the entrance. When he walked to the 4th brothel on the list, he realized that his method was not only stupid, but extremely stupid. There were so many brothels in Chang'an, and the environment was quiet and elegant. Which brothel did not have plump and popular girls? Wouldn't the chances of bumping into that old bear be too low if he were to recklessly bump into it like a blind bear? When he lingered outside the brothel for a while and turned to leave, he suddenly heard a silver bell-like voice behind him. The clear laughter floated far away on Chang'an Street, attracting the attention of countless people. Ning Kai suddenly turned around and saw that the brothel was brightly lit. The ladies who had not yet started work were leaning against the railings and laughing. Their red sleeves were waving wildly, as if they were teasing a young man who was too shy to enter. What a bully! He weighed the heavy silver bag in his sleeve and looked at the beautiful prostitutes who were smiling seductively upstairs. He made up his mind, raised his head, lifted the front of his scholar's robe, and walked into his new era in high spirits. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.